Houston Stewart Chamberlain was one of the most popular and influential political philosophers of the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And given the immensity of his popularity during that time, it is quite astounding that most people don't know his name. He was a friend and maintained a lengthy correspondence with Kaiser Wilhelm II. He was married to Richard Wagner's daughter. He had numerous connections with the upper nobility of Germany at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. His book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, were required reading and a main part of the curriculum of many German high schools during this time. He was celebrated in academia, even in the United States, being invited to lecture at top-tier universities such as Yale and Johns Hopkins. And all in all, his influence was immense. He was one of the most popular and well-known political philosophers of his time, supported by many, many people at the highest roles of society during that time. And today I will be reading for you a chapter, or the beginning of a chapter, from his book, The Foundations of the 19th Century. I will be releasing subsequently the next parts of this chapter. It's a long chapter. It's about 100 pages or so, and there will be multiple sections to this audiobook reading that will come out soon. I read this chapter purely for the purpose of historical documentation and provide no opinion on the issue apart from the fact that this was, like I've said, extremely celebrated and popular only 100 or so years ago. And to really think about the gulf of difference between what was not only acceptable in public discourse, but celebrated by people at the highest positions in society back then, only 100 years ago, compared to what is celebrated today and what is beyond taboo today, that it really kind of boggles the mind, and it makes you think what the hell happened during the interceding period. So, this is Chapter 5 of Houston Stewart Chamberlain's book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, The Entrance of the Jews into Western History. Thank you for watching. Chapter 5 of The Foundations of the 19th Century by Houston Stewart Chamberlain. The Entrance of the Jews into the History of the West. Quote, "Let us forget whence we spring. No more talk of German or Portuguese Jews. Though scattered over the earth, we are nevertheless a single people." End quote. Rabbi Solomon Lippmann Kerfber in the opening speech delivered on July 26, 1806, at the meeting preparatory to the Synedrium of 1807, which Napoleon called together. The Jewish Question. Had I been writing 100 years ago, I should hardly have felt compelled at this point to devote a special chapter to the entrance of the Jews into Western history. Of course, the share they had in the rise of Christianity, on account of the peculiar and absolutely un-Aryan spirit which they instilled into it, would have deserved our full attention, as well as also the economic part which they played in all Christian countries. But an occasional mention of these things would have sufficed. Anything more would have been superfluous. Herder wrote at that time, quote, "Jewish history takes up more room in our history and more attention than it probably deserves in itself. In the meantime, however, a great change has taken place. The Jews play in Europe, and wherever European influence extends, a different part today from that which they played 100 years ago. As Victor Hayne expresses it, we live today in a, quote, Jewish age. We may think what we'd like about the past history of the Jews. Their present history actually takes up so much room in our own history that we cannot possibly refuse to notice them. Herder, in spite of his outspoken humanism, has expressed the opinion that, quote, the Jewish people is and remains in Europe an Asiatic people, alien to our part of the world, bound to that old law which it received in a distant climate, and which, according to its own confession, it cannot do away with. End quote. Quite correct. But this alien people, everlastingly alien, because, as Herder well remarks, it is indissolubly bound to an alien law that is hostile to all other peoples. This alien people has become precisely, in the course of the 19th century, a disproportionately important, and in many spheres actually dominant, constituent in our life. Even 100 years ago, that same witness had sadly to confess that the, quote, ruder nations of Europe were willing slaves of Jewish usury, end quote. Today, he could say the same of by far the greatest part of the civilized world. The possession of money in itself is, however, of least account. Our governments, our law, our science, our commerce, our literature, our art, practically all branches of our life have become more or less willing slaves of the Jews, and drag the feudal fetter, ill not yet on two, at least on one leg. In the meantime, the alien element emphasized by Herder has become more and more prominent. 100 years ago, it was rather indistinctly and vaguely felt. Now it has asserted and proved itself, and so forced itself on the attention of even the most inattentive. The Indo-European, moved by ideal motives, opened the gates in friendship. The Jew rushed in like an enemy, stormed all positions, and planted the flag of his, to us, alien nature, I will not say on the ruins, but on the breaches of our genuine individuality. Are we, for that reason, to revile the Jews? That would be as ignoble as it is unworthy and senseless. The Jews deserve admiration, for they have acted with absolute consistency, according to the logic and truth of their own individuality, and never for a moment have they allowed themselves to forget the sacredness of physical laws, because of foolish humanitarian daydreams, which they shared only when such a policy was to their advantage. Consider with what mastery they used the law of blood to extend their power. The principal stem remains spotless. Not a drop of strange blood comes in. As it stands in the Torah, quote, a bastard shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord, even to his 10th generation shall he not enter into the congregation of the Lord, end quote. Deuteronomy chapter 23:2. In the meantime, however, thousands of side branches are cut off and employed to infect the Indo-Europeans with Jewish blood. If that were to go on for a few centuries, there would be in Europe only one single people of pure race, that of the Jews. All the rest would be a herd of pseudo-Hebraic mestizos, a people beyond all doubt degenerate physically, mentally, and morally. For even the great friend of the Jews, Ernest Renan, admits,
Je suis le premier à reconnaître que la race sémitique, comparée à la race indo-européenne, représente réellement une combinaison inférieure de la nature humaine.
And in one of his best but unfortunately little-known writings, he says again,
L'épouvantable simplicité de l'esprit sémitique rétrécit le cerveau humain, le ferme à toute idée délicate, à tout sentiment fin, à toute recherche rationnelle, pour le mettre en face d'une éternelle tautologie. Dieu est Dieu.
And he demonstrates that culture could have no future unless Christian religion should move farther away from the spirit of Judaism and the, quote, Indo-European genius, end quote, assert itself more and more in every domain. That mixture, then, undoubtedly signifies a degeneration. Degeneration of the Jew, whose character is much too alien, firm, and strong to be quickened and ennobled by Teutonic blood. Degeneration of the European, who can naturally only lose by crossing with an inferior type. Or, as I should prefer to say, with so different a type. While the mixture is taking place, the great chief stem of the pure unmixed Jews remains unimpaired. When Napoleon, at the beginning of the 19th century, dissatisfied that the Jews, in spite of their emancipation, should remain in proud isolation, angry with them for continuing to devour with their shameful usury the whole of his Alsace, although every career was now open to them, sent an ultimatum to the council of their elders, demanding the unreserved fusion of the Jews with the rest of the nation. The delegates of the French Jews adopted all the articles prescribed but one, namely, that which aimed at the absolute freedom of marriage with Christians. Their daughters might marry outside the Israelite people, but not their sons. The dictator of Europe had to yield. This is the admirable law by which real Judaism was founded. Indeed, the law, in its strictest form, forbids marriage altogether between Jews and non-Jews. In Deuteronomy 7:3, we read, "Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son." But, as a rule, emphasis is laid only on the last clause. For example, in Exodus chapter 34:16, the sons alone are forbidden to take strange daughters, not the daughters to take strange sons. And in Nehemiah chapter 13, after both sides have been forbidden to marry outside the race, only the marriage of a son with a foreign wife is described as a, quote, sin against God. That is also perfectly correct view. By the marriage of a daughter with a goy, the purity of the Jewish stem is in no way altered, while this stem thereby gets a footing in the strange camp. On the other hand, the marriage of a son with a goya, quote, makes the holy seed common, end quote, as the book of Ezra, chapter 9:2, drastically expresses it. The possible conversion of the goya to Judaism would not help matters. The idea of such a conversion was rightly quite strange to the older law, for the question is one of physical conditions of descent. But the new law says with enviable discernment, quote, proselytes are as injurious to Judaism as ulcers to a sound body. Thus was the Jewish race kept pure in the past, and it is still kept so. Daughters of the house of Rothschild have married barons, counts, dukes, princes. They submit to baptism without demur. No son has ever married a European. If he did so, he would have to leave the house of his fathers and the community of his people. These details are somewhat premature. They really belong to a latter portion of the book. But my object has been at once, and by the shortest way, to meet the objection, which, unfortunately, is still to be expected from many sides, that there is no Jewish question, from which would follow that the entrance of the Jews into our history had no significance. Others again talk of religion. It is a question, they say, of religious differences only. Whoever says this overlooks the fact that there would be no Jewish religion if there were no Jewish nation. But there is one. The Jewish nomocracy, that is, rule of the law, unites the Jews, no matter how scattered they may be over all the lands of the world, into a firm, uniform, and absolutely political organism, in which community of blood testifies to the common past and gives a guarantee for a common future. Though it has many elements not purely Jewish in the narrower sense of the word, yet the power of this blood, united with the incomparable power of the Jewish idea, is so great that these alien elements have long ago been assimilated. For nearly 2,000 years have passed since the time when the Jews gave up on their temporary inclination to proselytizing. Of course, I must, as I showed in the preceding chapter, distinguish between Jews of noble and of less noble birth, but what binds together their incompatible parts is, apart from gradual fusing, the tenacity of life which their national idea possesses. This national idea culminates in the unshakable confidence in the universal empire of the Jews, which Jehovah promised. Quote, "Simple people who have been born Christians," end quote, as Auerbach expresses it in his sketch of Spinoza's life, fancy that the Jews have given up that hope, but they are very wrong. For, quote, "the existence of Judaism depends upon the clinging to the messianic hope," end quote, as one of the very moderate and liberal Jews lately wrote. The whole Jewish religion is, in fact, founded on this hope. The Jewish faith in God, that which can and may be called religion, in their case, for it has become since the source of a fine morality, is a part of this national idea, not vice versa. To assert that there is a Jewish religion but no Jewish nation is simply nonsense. Footnote. At the Jewish Congress held in Basel in 1898, Dr. Mandelstam, professor in the University of Kiev, said in the chief speech of the sitting of August 29th, quote, "The Jews energetically reject the idea of fusion with other nationalities and cling firmly to their historical hope, i.e., of world empire." From a report of one who took part in the Congress in L'étang, September 2nd, 1898, the Vienna newspapers of July 30th and 31st, 1901, report a speech on Zionism which the Vienna rabbi Dr. Leopold Kahn delivered in a room of the Orthodox Jewish school in Pressburg. In this speech, Dr. Kahn made the following admission, quote, "The Jew will never be able to assimilate himself. He will never adopt the customs and ways of other peoples. The Jew remains Jew under all circumstances. Every assimilation is purely exterior." End quote. Words well worth laying to heart. In the Festschritt zum 70. Geburtstag a Berliners 1903, Dr. B. Felsenthal publishes a series of Jewish theses in which he supports with all his energy the thesis that Jewry is a people, not a religion. Quote, "Judaism is a special stem, and every Jew is born into this stem." End quote. This stem is, according to him, quote, "one of the ethnically purest peoples that exist." End quote. Felsenthal reckons that from Theodosius to the year 1800, quote, perhaps not quite 300 non-Semites were adopted into the Jewish race, end quote. And it is characteristic that he denies proselytes the right of looking upon themselves as full-blooded Jews. Quote, "The Jewish people, the Jewish stem, is the given fact, the constant thing, the necessary substratum, the substantial kernel. The Jewish religion is something attached to this kernel, a quality, an accident, as it is called in the language of the philosophical schools." End quote. I quote from the special impression made by Itzkowski, Berlin. End of footnote. The entry of the Jews into the history of the West signifies, therefore, beyond doubt, the entrance of a definite element, quite different from, and in a way opposed to all European races, an element which remained essentially the same, while the nations of Europe went through the most various phases, and, in the course of a hard and often cruel history, it never had the weakness to entertain proposals of fraternity, but, possessed as it was of its national idea, its national past, and its national future, felt and still feels all contact with others as a pollution, thanks also to the certainty of its instinct, which springs from strict uniformity of national feeling. It has always been able to exercise a powerful influence upon others, while the Jews themselves have been influenced but skim deep by our intellectual and cultural development. To characterize this most peculiar situation from the standpoint of the European, we must repeat the words of Herder. The Jewish people is and remains alien to our part of the world. From the standpoint of the Jew, the same fact is formulated somewhat differently. We know from a former chapter how the great free-thinking philosopher Philo put it, quote, "Only the Israelites are men in the true sense of the word." End quote. What the Jew here says in the intolerant tone of racial pride was more politely expressed by Goethe, when he disputed the community of descent of Jews and Indo-Europeans, no matter how far back the origin was put, quote, "We will not dispute with the chosen people the honor of its descent from Adam. We others, however, have certainly had other ancestors as well." End quote. The alien people. These considerations make it our right and our duty to look upon the Jew in our midst as a peculiar and, in fact, alien element. Outwardly, his inheritance was the same as ours. Inwardly, it was not so. He inherited quite a different spirit. One single trait is all that is necessary to reveal in an almost alarming manner to our consciousness the yawning gulf which here separates soul from soul. The revelation of Christ has no significance for the Jew. I do not here speak of pious orthodoxy at all, but read, for example, in Diderot, the notorious free thinker, the wonderful words on the crucified one. See how Diderot represents man in his greatest sorrow, turning to the divine one, and makes us feel that the Christian religion is the only religion in the world.
Quelle profonde sagesse il y a dans ce que l'aveugle philosophie appelle la folie de la croix. Dans l'état où j'étais, de quoi m'aurait servi l'image d'un législateur heureux et comblé de gloire? Je voyais l'innocent, le flanc percé, le front couronné d'épines, les mains et les pieds percés de clous, et expirant dans les souffrances, et je me disais, voilà mon Dieu, et j'ose me plaindre.
I have searched through a whole library of Jewish books in the expectation of finding similar words. Naturally, not belief in the divinity of Christ, nor the idea of redemption, but the purely human feeling for the greatness of a suffering Savior, but in vain. A Jew who feels that is, in fact, no longer a Jew, but a denier of Judaism. And while we find even in Muhammad's Quran at least a vague conception of the importance of Christ and profound reverence for his personality, a cultured, leading Jew of the 19th century calls Christ, quote, the new birth with the death mask, end quote, which inflicted new and painful wounds upon the Jewish people. He cannot see anything else in him. In view of the cross, he assures us that the, quote, Jews do not require this convulsive emotion for their spiritual improvement, end quote, and adds, quote, particularly not among the middle classes of the inhabitants of the cities, end quote. His comprehension goes no further. In a book republished in 1880 by a Spanish Jew, Mos de Leon, Jesus Christ is called a, quote, dead dog, end quote, that lies, quote, buried in a dunghill, end quote. Besides, the Jews have taken care to issue, in the later part of the 19th century, several editions, naturally in Hebrew, of the so-called, quote, censured passages, end quote, from the Talmud, those pages usually omitted, in which Christ is exposed to our scorn and hatred as a, quote, fool, sorcerer, profane person, idolater, dog, bastard, child of lust, etc. So, too, his sublime mother. We certainly do the Jews no injustice when we say that the revelation of Christ is simply something incomprehensible and hateful to them. Although he apparently sprang from their midst, he embodies, nevertheless, the negation of their whole nature, a matter in which the Jews are far more sensitive than we. This clear demonstration of the deep cleft that separates us Europeans from the Jew is by no means given in order to let religious prejudice, with its dangerous bias, settle the matter, but because I think that the perception of two so fundamentally different natures reveals a real gulf. It is well to look once into this gulf, so that on other occasions, where the two sides seem likely to unite each other, we may not be blind to the deep abyss which separates them. When we understand what a chasm there is between us, we are forced to a further conclusion. The Jew does not understand us, that is certain. Can we hope to understand him? To do him justice? Perhaps, if we are really intellectually and morally superior to him, as Renan insisted in the passage quoted above, and as other, perhaps more reliable scholars have likewise said. But we should then have to judge him from the lofty heights of our superiority, not from the low depths of hatred and superstition, and still less from the swampy shallows of misunderstanding, in which our religious teachers have been wading for the last 2,000 years. It is surely an evident injustice to ascribe to the Jew thoughts which he never had, to glorify him as the possessor of the most sublime religious intuitions, which were perhaps more alien to him than to anyone else in the world, and, at best, are to be found only in the hearts of a few scattered individuals as a cry of revolt against the special hardness of heart of this people. And then to condemn him for being today quite different from what he should be according to such fictitious conceptions. It is not only unfair, but, as regards public feeling, regrettably misleading. For through his connection with our religious life, a connection which is entirely fictitious, his head seems enveloped in a kind of nimbus, and then we are greatly incensed when we find no holy person under this sham halo. We expect more of the Jews than of ourselves, who are merely the children of the heathen. But the Jewish testimony is very different and more correct. It leads us to expect so little that every noble trait discovered later and every explanation found for Jewish failings gives us genuine pleasure. Jehovah, for instance, is never tired of explaining, quote, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people, end quote. And Jeremiah gives such a characterization of the moral constitution of the Jews that Monsieur Edouard Drummond could not wish it to be more richly colored. Quote, and they will deceive every one of his neighbor, and will not speak the truth. They have taught their tongues to speak lies, and weary themselves to commit iniquity. End quote. Little wonder, after this description, that Jeremiah calls the Jews, quote, an assembly of treacherous men, end quote, and knows only one desire, quote, oh, that I had in the wilderness a lodging place of wayfaring men, that I might leave my people and go from them, End quote. For our incredible ignorance of the Jewish nature, we are ourselves solely to blame. Never did a people give so comprehensive and honest a picture of its own personality as the Hebrew has done in his Bible, a picture which, so far as I can judge from fragments, is made more complete by the Talmud, though in faded colors, without, therefore, denying that it must be very difficult for us who are, quote, descended from other ancestors, end quote, to form a correct judgment of the, quote, alien Asiatic people, end quote. We must clearly see that the Jews from time immemorial have done their best to inform the unprejudiced about themselves, a circumstance which entitles us to hope that we may gain a thorough knowledge of their nature. As a matter of fact, the events which take place before our eyes should be sufficient for that. Is it possible to read the daily papers without becoming acquainted with Jewish ways of thinking, Jewish taste, Jewish morals, Jewish aims? A few annual volumes of the Archives Israelites teach us, in fact, more than the whole anti-Semitic library. And indeed, not only about the less admirable, but also about the excellent qualities of the Jewish character. But here, in this chapter, I shall leave the present out of account. If we are to form a practical and true judgment concerning the significance of the Jew as joint heir and fellow worker in the 19th century, we must above all become clear as to what he is. From what a man is by nature follows of strict necessity what he will do under certain conditions. The philosopher says, "Operari sequitur es." An old German proverb expresses the same thing in a more homely way. Only what a man is can one get out of him. Historical bird's eye view. Pure history, in this case, does not bring us either quickly or surely to our goal, and besides, it is not my task to furnish a history of the Jews. As in other chapters, so here too, I have a horror of copying what has been written before. Every one, of course, knows how and when the Jews entered into Western history. First, by the diaspora, then by being scattered. Their changing fortunes in various lands and times are likewise no secret to us, although, indeed, much that we know is absolutely untrue, and of much that we ought to know we are entirely ignorant. But I do not need to tell anyone that throughout the Christian centuries the Jews played an important, though at times circumscribed, role. Even in the earliest Western Gothic times, they understood how to acquire influence and power as slave dealers and financial agents. Though they were not everywhere, as they were among the Spanish Moors, powerful ministers of state, who, following the examples of Mordecai, filled the most lucrative posts with their many brothers, though they did not attain everywhere, as they did in Catholic Spain, to the rank of bishop and archbishop, yet their influence was always and everywhere great. The Babenberg princes, as early as the 13th century, set their successors the example of letting Jews manage the finances of their state, and honoring these administrators with titles of distinction. The great Pope Innocent III gave important posts at his court to Jews. The knights of France had to pledge their goods with the Jews in order to be able to take part in the Crusades. Rudolf von Habsburg favored the Jews in every way. He vindicated them as, quote, servants of his imperial exchequer, end quote, and by freeing them from being subject to ordinary justice, he made it very difficult, indeed, for any action brought against them to be carried through. In short, what I call the entrance of the Jews into Western history has never ceased to make itself felt at all times and places. If anyone were qualified to study history for the sole purpose of disentangling the question of Jewish influence, he would, I think, bring to light some unexpected facts. Without this detailed study, the fact of this influence can only be established clearly and beyond doubt where the Jews were in considerable numbers. In the 2nd century, for example, the Jews on the island of Cyprus are more numerous than the other inhabitants. They resolved to found a national state, and with this intent follow the procedure known from the Old Testament. They slay in one day all the other inhabitants, 240,000 in number. And in order that this island state may not be without support on the mainland, they at the same time slay 220,000 non-Jewish inhabitants of Cyrene. In Spain, they pursue the same policy with greater caution and astonishing perseverance. Under the rule of that thoroughly Western Gothic king, who had showered benefits on them, they invite their kinsmen, the Arabs, to come over from Africa, and, not out of any ill feeling, but simply because they hope to profit thereby, they betray their noble protector. Under the caliphs, they then acquire gradually an ever larger share in the government. Quote, they concentrated, their great supporter, the historian Heman, writes, the intellectual and the material powers all together in their own hands. End quote. The prosperous Moorish state was, it is true, thereby intellectually and materially ruined, but this was a matter of indifference to the Jews, as they had already obtained as firm a footing in the Christian state of the Spaniards, which was destined to take the place of the Moorish one. Quote, the movable wealth of the land was here absolutely in their power. The heritable property they made gradually theirs by usury and the purchase of mortgaged estates of nobles. From the offices of Secretary of State and Minister of Finance, downwards all the offices which had to do with taxes and money were in Jewish hands. Through usury, almost all Aragon was mortgaged to them. In the cities, they formed the majority of the wealthy population. End quote. But here, as elsewhere, they were not always shrewd. They had employed their power to obtain all kinds of privileges. For example, the oath of a single Jew sufficed to prove debt claims against Christians. The same was the case in the Archduchy of Austria and in many other places. While the testimony of a Christian against a Jew had no weight before a tribunal, and so on. These privileges they abused so outrageously that the people finally revolted. The same would probably have happened in Germany if the church and intelligent statesmen had not put a stop to the evil in time. Charlemagne had written to Italy for Jews to manage his finances. Soon, as farmers of taxes, they secured for themselves wealth and influence in every direction, and used these to get important concessions for their people, such as commercial privileges, less severe punishment for crime, and the like. The whole population was even forced to make Sunday their market day, as Saturday, the customary market day, did not suit the Jews, because it was their Sabbath. It was, at that time, fashionable for courtiers to visit the synagogues. But the reaction set in soon and strongly, and not only, as the historians are wont to represent, as it is the result of priestly agitation, such things belong to the shell, not to the kernel of history, but in the first place because the Teuton is, in fact, just as much a born merchant and industrialist as he is a born warrior, and because as soon as the growth of the cities awakened these instincts in him, he saw the game of his unfair rival, and full of violent indignation demanded his removal. And so, If such were the power of this chapter, we could trace the ebb and flow of Jewish influence to the present day, when all the wars of the 19th century are so peculiarly connected with Jewish financial operations, from Napoleon's Russian campaign and Nathan Rothschild's role of spectator at the Battle of Waterloo, to the consulting of the Bleichroders on the German side and of Alphonse Rothschild on the French side, at the peace transactions of the year 1871, and to the Commune, which, from the beginning, was looked upon by all intelligent people as a Jewish Napoleonic machination. Consensus Ingeniorum. Now, this political and social influence of the Jews has been very variously judged, but the greatest politicians of all times have regarded it as pernicious. Cicero, for example, no great politician but an experienced statesman, displays a genuine fear of the Jews where a legal transaction encroaches on their interest. He speaks so low that only the judges can hear him, for he is well aware, as he says, that all the Jews hold together and that they know how to ruin the one who opposes them. While he thunders the most vehement charges against Greeks, against Romans, against the most powerful men of his time, he advises caution in dealing with the Jews. They are to him an uncanny power, and he passes with the greatest haste over the city of, quote, suspicion and slander, Jerusalem. Such was the opinion of a Cicero during the consulate of a Julius Caesar. Even before the destruction of Jerusalem, the Emperor Tiberius, who was, according to many historians, the best ruler that Roman Imperium ever possessed, recognized a national danger in the immigration of the Jews. Even Friedrich II, the Hohenstaufen, certainly one of the most brilliant men that ever wore a crown or carried a sword, a more free-thinking man than any monarch of the 19th century, an enthusiastic admirer of the East, and a generous supporter of Hebrew scholars, nevertheless held it to be his duty, contrary to the custom of his contemporaries, to debar the Jews from all public offices, and pointed warningly to the fact that wherever the Jews are admitted to power, they abuse it. The very same doctrine was taught by the other great Friedrich II, the Hohenzollern, who gave universal freedom, but not to the Jews. Similar were the words of Bismarck. While he could speak openly in the Landtag, 1847, and the great historian Mommsen speaks of Judaism as of a, quote, state inside the state, end quote. As regards the social influence in particular, I will only quote two wise and fair authorities, whose judgment cannot be suspected even by the Jews, namely Herder and Goethe. The former says, quote, a ministry in which the Jew is supreme, a household in which the Jew has the key of the wardrobe and the management of the finances, a department or commissariat in which the Jews do the principal business, are Pontine marshes that cannot be drained, end quote. And he expresses the opinion that the presence of an indefinite number of Jews is so pernicious to the welfare of a European state that we, quote, dare not be influenced by general humane principles, end quote. It is a national question, and it is the duty of every state to decide, quote, how many of this alien people can be tolerated without injury to the true citizens, end quote. Goethe goes still deeper. Quote, how should we let the Jews share in our highest culture when they deny its origin and source, end quote. And he becomes, quote, violently enraged when the law of 1823 permitted marriage between Jews and Germans, prophesying the, quote, worst and most frightful consequences, end quote, particularly the, quote, undermining of all moral feelings, end quote, and declaring that the bribery of the, quote, all-powerful Rothschild, end quote, must be the cause of this, quote, folly. Goethe and Herder have exactly the same opinion as the great Hohenstaufen, the great Hohenzollern, and all great men before and after them. Without superstitiously reproaching the Jews with their peculiar individuality, they consider them an actual danger to our civilization and our culture. They would not give them an active part in our life. We cannot proceed with our discussion and simply pass over such a consensus ingeniorum. For to these well-weighted, serious judgments, derived from the fullness of experience and the insight of the greatest intellects, we have nothing to oppose but the empty phrases of the droit de l'homme, a parliamentary claptrap.